Good evening, folks. We are live with tonight's online review session as we prepare for the HuGe HuGe exam coming up here in the next couple of days, on Friday to be exact. So I'm going to go ahead and start our online review session now. And remember that you can catch this on demand anytime by just using the link all over again. Again, it won't be live the next time, but it will certainly be available to you to use. So we are going to start answering some of your questions now. So if you go ahead and start typing in, right-hand side of the screen, you should see something that says chat. Go ahead and start asking questions, and I'll start answering them. Just want to give you guys a couple of quick rundown of what we're going to be doing tonight. I'm going to ask you guys again to ask as many questions as possible. That's why we're here for the next hour, to answer as many questions as possible. And what I'll do is, if need be, I'll kind of expand and go off into a certain area. So for example, if someone asks about population, I might go off and touch on how it talks about migration. If someone's talking about industrialization, I might touch on development a little bit. So that's kind of what we got going on for tonight for our review. So that's what we are going to be working on for tonight. So one more thing before we get started, just a reminder, folks, that this is supposed to be a review. This is not going to be this all-encompassing, tell you everything you need to know. But one of the things that I think would be very good for you to know is that a reminder that it's not possible, that this course is not designed to be the type of course where you know everything about everything. That's just not going to be the case. Instead, it's all about the application. How well can you apply what you have learned this year to the real world? And that's kind of what it's really about. So it's about taking the ideas that we've talked about all year and then applying that to the real world. That's really what we're looking at. So there you go. So that's what we got. So we will start with some questions. So please make sure you're answering those questions as they come up to you, and we will go ahead and answer any questions. So one of the things I want to start off talking with in terms of the online review here is, remember to think broad, right? We're talking about these broad ideas. We're talking about using the population demographic transition model, using that and applying it to other countries, or being able to look at a population pyramid and applying it to and being able to analyze it and understand what's going on with it, being able to look at an upside down population pyramid or a upside down triangle and being able to tell that is a lesser that is a country that is further along in the demographic transition model, and a country that's going to have lower population birth rates and then lower you know, a lower infant mortality rate and a longer life expectancy. And again, being able to talk about what that means. So that's kind of what we're looking at when we talk about our information on our exam. So that's kind of what we're looking at in that regard. Now, a couple things before we get started with your questions. Again, if you do have any questions, please go ahead and type those out so we can answer those questions for you. But want to start off and just look at some of the main ideas and some of the main models you guys have looked at this year. Never a bad thing to be able to know those models. So, of course, the demographic transition model, as well as the population pyramids and how that all affects. That was our big idea for our population and migration unit. Of course, language tree, religious trees. We talked about that in our culture unit. The Rostow model, of course, talked about that over the course of our year with development and how countries get developed, or of course what we like to call the Brostow model. Talk more about that hopefully later on tonight. The von Thunen model, special shout out to Anina on that one, and of course the Weber's least cost theory, which we have explained as well. So those are kind of some of our big models. And again, being able to look at those models and applying those models, that's really what we're looking for in that regard. So that's kind of one of the things that we're thinking of. So be sure that you're talking about that. The models, again, big time assistance in that regard. In terms of the countries. One of the things that you guys may be tempted to look at, I know for some of you that we've looked at those practice tests, that, you know, sometimes they can be a little bit specific. But again, what we're doing with that, the goal of that is for you to be able to say, when you're looking at, say, a country, and maybe you don't know the exact demographic transition model of, say, Mali. Well, you should know, of course, approximately where in the world it is and what is the roughly what is the population pyramid like of that area. So that's one of the things that we're looking at in that regard. So, all right. So let's see what type of questions we got here, and then we'll go ahead and answer some more, hopefully. First question is, what are the most important things that we should know about the agriculture unit for the test? Just general facts that would help us out the most. The big thing for agriculture is going to be where agriculture is and the type of agriculture that you're going to have. So really knowing where we're going to have the subsistence agriculture being taken place and where our commercial agriculture is taking place. So for example, subsistence agriculture we know is farming for survival. Those are some folks that are farming. If they don't farm, they don't eat. If they don't farm, they don't really survive. And there are two types of subsistence farming. There is intensive subsistence farming and there is extensive subsistence farming. So knowing where that type of agriculture takes place is important. So we look at intensive subsistence. The reason why they call it intensive subsistence farming is because it's very work intensive. It's very hard. It's very difficult work. One of the things we think about when we think about wet rice, and we think about wet rice going on in Asia. For extensive agriculture, that is agriculture that is going to be taking up a large amount of land, an extensive amount of land. So intensive, we're working really hard. Extensive, we are taking up a lot of land. Now, extensive agriculture is extensive for a couple of reasons. Number one area you find extensive agriculture in is the dry lands of the world, specifically areas of the world that are in less developed countries that are dry. So I'm thinking, for example, a really good one to think about would be Mongolia. Mongolia has a lot of dry lands in it, and so they're going to practice an extensive form of agriculture called pastoral nomadism, where they're going to essentially follow herds of animals. There's going to be this transhumanist, this seasonal migration, where in the summer times the animals go to the highlands, to the mountains to graze, and in the winter time to get off the mountains, they're grazing in the lowlands. And then that's eventually going to go off to market to be slaughtered, to be used in many other ways. But that's an example of extensive agriculture. Now, since it's a little bit more of a dry land, you're not really having a bunch of people that are using that land because it's a dry land. Now, dry lands and pastoral nomadism, of course, is something that is going away because as agricultural practices have gotten better, as irrigation has gotten better, as we've been able to grow things in more extreme climates, we don't want to waste that land as much. And so we're going to try and use that. Another good example of extensive subsistence agriculture would be in slash and burn agricultural societies, or agriculture that's going on in the subtropics, areas like, for example, the Amazonian rainforest, areas like sub-Saharan Africa, where you still have people who practice shifting cultivation through this idea of slash and burn. One of the things I was talking about in class was the idea that when I went to Africa for a safari for my honeymoon, when you fly over the plains, it looks like when you fly in a plane over there, it looks like there's a series of small fires going on. And you think, oh my gosh, there's this wildfire that's raging through. No, that's just slash and burn agriculture. Now, slash and burn agriculture is going to take up a lot of land because you have to slash the land, you have to burn the land, allow those nutrients to go in, and then you're going to plant. Now, that's going to take up a lot of land and take up a lot of time. That's extensive. So again, knowing where those are is extremely important. Going to our other form of agriculture we know is commercial agriculture. And commercial agriculture is farming for profit. And really, that's where our friend Mr. von Thunen comes in with the von Thunen model, where the idea being that our agriculture is going to be located in part because of the environment. There's no denying that, but also in relation to the major city of the area. Now, at von Thunen's time, it was the major city. Today, it's our major continental area, our major country area. That's kind of what we're looking at. So again, with our von Thunen model, real quick, we got our central city. Outside of the central city, we have a form of intensive commercial agriculture. Now, intensive commercial agriculture is something like dairying, with milking of cows, churning of butter, collection of eggs, that type of stuff. That's a very intensive process, and it needs to be close to the city because we're worried about spoiling. Despite the fact that we still have refrigeration today, which has made the milk shed grow, which has spread the milk shed out, despite the fact that that has happened, we are still looking for that agricultural ring, that dairy ring to be close to the city because we're worried about that milk shed and it spoiling, as well as other fresh produce, smaller types of fresh produce. In our second ring, we have the lumber area, of course. Now, lumber, that doesn't make sense. Why is it so close? Lumber, you think big area it needs with forests to grow. Yes, but remember, lumber is also very heavy. So lumber needs to be located close to the city to minimize those transportation costs, because that's the other part of the von Thunen model. You want to be able to make enough money by having a profitable area, but you also want to make money by having transportation be efficient as well. That brings us to our next ring, which is the extensive field crop ring. This is our grain, this is our corn, where we need large areas of land. Well, large areas of land don't work in the city or near the city because that is very expensive land. We need lots of land. Remember, extensive, large amounts of land. We need extensive land in order to grow our crops. Where do we find extensive land? We find that outside the city, and we find that far from the city. And that's where we're gonna have our big farms. We're gonna be able to use our big farm equipment and so on and so forth. Finally, our last ring, we have the ranching ring. And that's where our animals are able to graze out there on the least productive land, and then they can transport themselves into the area. So really, agriculture, what you need to know about agriculture is where it's practiced and why it's practiced where it is. Subsistence agriculture, practiced where it is because of the environment, obviously the climatic zones that we talked about, as well as practiced for commercial way of reasons as well. That's where we're looking at things, for example, like our von Thunen model. So all of those are super important. So I would definitely focus on in terms of why our certain agriculture is where it is. Bailey Jennings would like to talk about the idea of refugees. Refugees are from our migration unit, and refugees are a form of migrants. And refugees are going to be moving because of a forced factor. They are going to be pushed out of their area. Remember when we talked about migration, we talked about push and we talked about pull factors. Push factors are reasons that people are pushed out of an area. Pull factors draw people into an area. So a push factor for a refugee is going to be a fear of persecution. That's a fear of political persecution. It's a fear of religious persecution. It's a fear of ethnic persecution. The idea behind a refugee is that you have this fear that you are going to be killed, you are going to be harmed, that you cannot return to your area, and that is a refugee. Now, refugees are very important in the United States in terms of migration because we look very fondly upon refugees. Refugees get to kind of jump the front of the line a little bit because we in America are so concerned about being the land of the free, being the land of people that are not being persecuted. So the idea is those refugee folks get to skip the line a little bit. Now, this is controversial because some people say, well, wait a second, we've been waiting in line. We shouldn't have to be jumped in line by these refugees. That's why actually using the terminology refugee can sometimes be a controversial thing. But when we talk about refugees, we're talking about political, we're talking about religious, we're talking about ethnic, anything to do with a cultural refugee. Now, when we talk about a refugee, we're also talking about people that are going to be coming probably from areas that are going to be war-torn, areas that are going to be having a civil war. That's what we're kind of looking at. I don't want to litigate the question of economic refugees all over again, because many of you know how I feel on the subject of environmental refugees, I mean to say. So I don't want to really get involved into that concept of that. But Again, a refugee is someone who is persecuted. Now, the opposite of a refugee is someone who is going because of a pull factor. They're moving to an area because of a new job. They're moving to an area because the weather is better. My uncle moved from New York to Florida because he didn't want to deal with the snow anymore. That's a pull factor. That's someone who is leaving because of environmental pull factor. My uncle moved from New York to Florida because he retired there because it was cheaper to live there. That's an economic pull factor. It's pulling him into that area. I might move to say Utah because I'm a Mormon, and it's a tight-knit Mormon community out there. That might be another pull factor. So when we talk about push and pull factors are enticing people to move somewhere. They're drawing people in. A push factor is shoving people out, and a refugee certainly falls in line with a push factor. Now, for America, the number one reason why people come to America, and really the number one reason why we have all types of migrants, is because of the economic side. Economic refugees are going to be coming to not only America, but other areas because they're going to try and get jobs. Now, this delves into the idea then of time contract workers as well as guest workers. Those people that are here for a specific for a specific time, and they have to leave. Some people that are here with green cards and all that type of stuff. So that is one of the things we're looking at. But that is the idea of a refugee. All right, let's move down to the next question here. Jenna Gilbert asks a question. Can you go over the difference between race, ethnicity, and nationality? Absolutely, Jenna. So the question, so the idea here between race, ethnicity, and nationality. Race is something that you are born with. It is a biological thing that cannot be changed. It's a biological thing. There's far fewer races than we think of then we kind of ascribe. We kind of ascribe everything to be a race. And we talked about this in class when we talked about the idea of, oh, well, I have Irish blood in me, or I have Italian blood in me. And we talked about that doesn't really gel. It doesn't really make sense. Race is something that is a genetic thing. Now, when scientists have done all these genetic studies, there's not much genetic difference between the races, but there still is a slight difference in genetics between the races, which of course is what we think of when we describe race. That is a genetic thing. It's something we're born with. When we talk about ethnicity, ethnicity is something that we kind of self-identify with. This is where when we go around the room and we ask you, what's your ethnicity? This is where you'll say things like, I'm Irish, I'm Italian, I'm German. And we do that because we think of this is where people are coming, this is where our ancestors have come from, and this is the cultural practices that we have. And that's really the main idea behind ethnicity, is it's a cultural practice. Yes, it's tied to the ancestral land, but it's tied to an ancestral land, and this is where we came from, not tied from a genetic type of idea. So when we talk about ethnicity, we're talking about a cultural thing. We're talking about the traditions that we follow. We're talking about where we trace our ancestry with grandparents and great-grandparents type of thing through. That's the idea of a ethnicity. But again, there's no genetic marker in there. And then finally, we have the idea of a nationality. And the nationality is one of those things that this can change the quickest. Race, of course, is the hardest to change. Ethnicity, next hardest. But nationality is the quickest, because nationality, that's just simply where we follow the legal laws from, where our passport's from, and that type of thing. So when we talk about nationality, we're talking about much more of a legality type of thing. And if we want to not be American, all we got to do is go to the next country over, surrender our American passport, and boom, we have a new nationality. So it's a legal status. Now, some people will talk pridefully about certain nationalities and everything, and that's great, but it's the easiest thing to change because it's simply a legal status, and that's the difference between those two. Next question we move on here for Tiffany is, random question, have you scheduled our final? Tiffany, we're not discussing that. Jess, what is the Malthus theory, and how can it or it can't be used to predict future problems? The idea of Malthus was very concerned with overpopulation. Malthus believed that our population was growing in far too fast of a manner, that our population was outgrowing our food supply. And what Malthus feared was that with our population continuing to grow and grow and grow, that our food was only going to statically go up. It was going to go up arithmetically. Malthus thought population went up exponentially. Here's the problem. Malthus never took into account that people would think that children are financial black holes, as we've talked about numerous times. The idea that Malthus didn't take into account that people would choose to have less kids as their income went up, as women got greater status, and our ability to use food and save food was greatly underestimated by Malthus. Malthus never took into account that we have refrigeration, that we have food preservation, we have freezers, that we can eat canned corn 5 years from now. That never entered Malthus's mind. So we were able to make food more than our population, and so now that's okay. Now, there are some neo-Malthusians, and some neo-Malthusians will say, well, Malthus might have been wrong about the developed world, but in the developing world, in less developed countries, this is a major problem because the population continues to grow and grow and grow and grow. Now, that's true. However, we have all sorts of things that help us out. We have the Green Revolution where we have higher yielding crops. We also have different types of food that we're using. We're cultivating the seas, as we talked about in class not that long ago. We're also eating bugs and all this other type of stuff that's allowing us to do that. So what's happening is there are neo-Malthusians who are saying this is still a problem, but it's not in the developed world, it's in the developing world. So Malthus was very concerned about overpopulation and the possible effect that it had on that area. So he predicted future problems. He predicted famine. He predicted fights and civil wars over food and everything else. But that, of course, never came to fruition. Neo-Malthusians will say, well, it might come to fruition later on at the time. All right, good questions thus far. Let's continue to keep on going here. Emily Norton asks the question, can you go over where religions are located in the United States and why? This came to us from a free response question on the AP exam not that long ago. And religions, remember, religions are things that usually gets passed down from father to son, mother to daughter, from mom and dad to kids. So religion really follows this chain migration type of idea. And where there's a lot of people of one religion, there's usually going to be a lot more people. It's going to be clustered in that area. So a couple of religions that we should focus about. When we talk about Roman Catholicism primarily going to be located in the Northeast and the Southwest. Why? Northeast, that's where we had a lot of Irish immigrants who came over with their religion and Italian immigrants who came over with their religion. Of course, you guys have talked, we've talked extensively in class this year about my diversity on Long Island, where I grew up, with the idea of everyone being essentially, you were either Roman Catholic or Irish Catholic. There, that was your difference, right? So migration patterns led to the fact that when the Irish and the Italians moved to the New York, Boston, Northeast corridor area, that's where we have a lot of Catholics. Also, in the Southwest, we have a lot of Catholics as well, because that's where the Spanish, of course, traditionally settled. And the Spanish, of course, when they settled, were Hispanics. Spanish were Hispanics. The Spanish were Catholics. And so they use, that goes all the way back to the original colonialization of the Spanish. And it also goes back to Hispanic Americans that have moved up and brought their religion with them from other parts of Latin America. So we've seen that. In the South, we traditionally have a Baptist organization. Now, why is that the case? Well, the Baptists are located down there because we're primarily a rural society. Not a lot of interaction, not a lot of cities, not a lot of chance for immigration for other groups. So they've kind of kept their traditional religions there, and it's been able to expand and grow through natural population growth down there. But it hasn't had a whole lot of competition, unlike, say, the Northeast, where you might have diversity in terms of Catholicism, diversity in terms of Islam, diversity in terms of Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism. You don't have that diversity nearly as much in the North. So baptism has been able to flourish throughout the South, otherwise known as the Bible Belt. Now, an interesting one that we don't think of too much is the idea of a Lutheran. And Lutherans are going to be trace their roots through German. So any area where you're going to see a lot of German immigrants, that's where you're going to see a lot of Lutherans. And we see a lot of German immigrants in the north central portion of the United States. Minnesota, Wisconsin, that type of area where we have lots of German immigrants who settled there. They brought their religion with them, and then of course Mormons, probably the one that most people remember from that particular unit was, of course, the idea that Mormons were settling in Utah. And the reasons why Mormons went there was that's where they settled from their migration when, of course, they came over with their leader, Brigham Young, and they settled in that area. Same exact thing. Not a lot of migration in that area, not a lot of big cities in that area. So they were kind of left to their own devices in that area and kind of spread out within that area. So that's why religions are where they are in terms of the US. Good question with that. Kareem asks, primate city versus ranked rule and examples of each. Primate city versus ranked rule is when we talk about cities and we talk about the size of cities. How do we measure that? Well, the primate city rule says that if we look at a country's cities and our largest city is so much bigger, more than double the size of the next largest city in the country, that is primate city. What does it mean to be a primate city? What it means to be a primate city is your country really is stuck with that city. That city is the basis of your country. Is your country going to be going through an economic depression? Look at that city. Is your country going to be doing economically well? Look at that city. The political, the cultural, the economic center of your country is going to probably fall in that one city. And that's the primate city rule. Prime, meaning one. You really have one perfect example. Now, remember, these are all models. So we're not talking about exactly if it's not half. We're talking roundabout. So if we have a country where we have a population of a city of, say, 10 million people, and the next one's like 2, then we know it's a primate city because there's an 8 million person gap between one and the next. Off the top of my head, I'm thinking Mexico, and Mexico City being a primate city. Mexico City, so much larger than any other city in Mexico. It's an example of primate city. And that's going to cause some possible economic problems in your country because only one of your cities may be getting developed, and that can be pretty tough. In terms of rank size rule, rank size is the idea that your country has a nice orderly size of cities. So your largest city and then your next largest city is going to be half as large as that, and then half as large as that, and then half as large as that, and so on and so on, and down we go. And that is a city, that's a sign of a country that has maybe multiple areas. Maybe one area is an economic area, one area is a political area, one area is a social area, whatever it might be. That's when we talk about cities that, or countries that are kind of more evenly developed, not one area really driving anything else. Think about areas in Germany, for example, good example of some areas where you might have some rank size rule, where you don't have one city that's overwhelmingly large compared to everything else. So that's a good question. All right, next question over here is from Anina. Anina, the epidemiological transition model and how it relates to the demographic transition model. The epidemiologic transition, like I said that, the epidemiologic transition model is why people die in each stage of the demographic transition model. So in stage 1, the say it 3 times fast. The epidemiological transition model is going to say, this is why people die in stage 1. This is why people die in stage 2 countries. This is why people die in stage 3 countries. This is why people die in stage 4 countries. Now, for the length of time, I'm not going to go over all of it real quick here, but we'll just go over it real quick. In your first stage of the epidemiological transition model, that's where you're going to have things like cholera and bubonic plague and all these types of stuff, because you're not a really developed country. You're not a really well-advanced country. So you're going to die from these diseases that you should be able to kind of, defeat. In our stage 2 countries, that's when we're kind of starting to get to this whole industrialization idea, trying to get to this whole urbanization thing. That's when we're going to start to have city problems, tuberculosis and other type of stuff. As we progress, we're going to get more in terms of degenerative diseases or things like heart disease. So in stage 4, you have a lot of people that are dying from heart disease. They're getting from our fatty, fast foods. They're going to be dying because of clogged arteries. You don't have people dying of clogged arteries in stage 1 or stage 2 countries because there's not the wealth, there's not the extravagance in that area to do it. So the epidemiological transition model, why people die in each stage of the demographic transition, and we get to as we get more and more developed, the things that we die from are less and less easy to fix. So early on, that's why we see that drop of that death rate pretty quick, because we say things like, hey, when you operate on somebody, you should probably wash your hands. Oh my gosh, wash your hands. Who would have thought? So that's kind of what you see in one of those regards. When we talk about stage 4 and stage 5 countries, that's when kind of people are dying from longer degenerative diseases, Alzheimer's, cancer, stuff that takes longer to figure out how can we go about fixing that type of stuff. Now, in a really cool thing, there are some people who are prophesizing that what we could see in stage 5 is this return to these death rates of people dying from things like influenza in like massive amounts because we're so interconnected. We'll see what that happens. But epidemiological transition model, why people die in each stage of the demographic transition model. Take a look at it. Pretty cool. Rachel K asks, could you go over devolution and supranationalism and examples of each? Absolutely, Rachel. Devolution is when states are going to give up power. They're going to give up central power and give it to a more local or regional level. Now, the reason why you do this is maybe you have some ethnic groups that are fighting and you want to say, you know what, we're going to give this ethnic group over here some power so that way they don't rebel. Maybe we're going to give some religion here a little bit more power so they don't rebel. So the idea of devolution is giving up central power to give more local power. Now, what this could wind up doing is devolution could possibly lead to states breaking up and saying we are never, ever, ever getting back together. Because when you give up power, sometimes people like that power too much and say, hey, let's go our separate ways. And that's one of the things we saw in Yugoslavia, where you had this devolution, this breakup in terms of all these different ethnic groups that were fighting all these different ethnic areas, and now they have all that. And that is the direction that we as a world are heading towards. There are far more countries that are being created than are going away. Our world is heading towards this devolution where we are giving up more power to the local peoples to allow them to decide for themselves. It started off during the end of the Soviet Union, with the breakup of the Soviet Union, when we had central powers that were giving up powers to local peoples. So that way there was not these rebellions. People began to want to run themselves. One of the major ideas behind devolution is the idea of self-determination. People want to decide for themselves what they're going to do, what's going to happen to them. And that's the idea of devolution. Again, sometimes it can lead to a breakup of a state. It doesn't always have to, but what it does have to do is give up power from a central to a local level. Now, on to your second question of supranationalism. Supranationalism is the idea that countries are going to be giving up their power for a common good, for a greater goal. So let's look at the European Union. The European Union has said over time, you know what we're going to do? We're going to give up some of our trading power, meaning we're going to stop blocking trade between one country and another country, and instead we're going to work together. So what we're going to do is we're going to get rid of borders, and that's going to promote economic stability and economic growth. And we talked about this in my class. We talked about the idea that the European Union as being like Costco. And if you think about it, Costco, of course, what's the idea? What's the idea of Costco is you're buying in bulk. Well, that's what the European Union does. The European Union buys in bulk. And so the idea is if we buy tons and 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 tons of goods, we can get it for a cheaper rate than if we're just each one of our individual countries buying it. Here's the problem with that, Rachel. You have to be able as a country to say, we're going to give up some of our self-determination, or we're going to give up some of our sovereignty. And that's a rare thing. Countries don't want to give it up. Or if they do give it up, they're giving it up for a very specific reason. If it's the European Union, it's for economic growth. If it's NATO, it's for security. They're giving it up for very specific reasons, and that's an example of supranational organization. Hope that worked out for you. Next question, can you talk about the multiple nuclei model and the peripheral models? Yes, the multiple nuclei model is a part of our cities and urban land use. So we have three models when we talk about cities and urban land use. We have the concentric zone model, we have the sector model, and we have the multiple nuclei model. So if we look at the concentric zone model, here's kind of the concentric zone model right over here. Very similar to our von Thunen model, where we have a central city and then we have a series of rings that are going to go outside of that. Now that's important because these are primarily older cities in which the main center area was a church or a marketplace. And that's our concentric zone model. A lot of European cities are based like that. Our sector model is next. That's model number 2. And the sector model is where you have those sectors of the city that you quite literally have sections of the city that are divided up. So you have the transportation section. You have the middle class section. You have the upper class housing section, whatever it is. That's going to be primarily found in Latin American countries and Asian countries, or any area that was kind of colonialized, because the idea, remember, was get goods in, get goods out. Use goods out. Use goods in, use goods out. That was the idea behind it. So we're going to see that in there. Finally, the multiple nuclei model that you speak of. The multiple nuclei model, if you think about what a nucleus is the center of the cell. Well, a multiple nucleus model means there are multiple areas of a city that are going to have activity. And it makes sense if you think about it, because if we think about the multiple nuclei model, there might be one area of a city that over here that might be the business area. This might be where all the business is. Well, over here, this might be where the airport is, and that's where all the transportation sectors are. And over here, this might be where the residential area is. So there's going to be a mall around there. So a multiple nuclei model is when our cities are developing with multiple centers in multiple areas, not just one area as a CBD, but multiple CBDs. This is the case in a lot of new cities as they develop their own things, as they develop their own ideas, and as they are developing their own things. So newer cities, faster growing cities are going to be multiple nuclei model. One of the great ways I think about the multiple nuclei model in your mind is if you think about cities that have different ethnic centers, right? Different Chinatowns, little Italies, little Havanas. Those are good examples of multiple nuclei because there's different pockets of where there's activity. This might be one area that has one activity. This might be another activity over here. So that's what we talk about when we talk about the multiple nuclei models. In terms of the periphery model, there's this idea out there called the core periphery model. And the core periphery model idea is that there is at the center of everything, there's this well-developed core. And then outside of this well-developed core, there's the periphery. But it varies based upon scale. Let's take Northern Virginia, for example. If we look at the state of Virginia, the core of Virginia is Northern Virginia. We make the money for the majority of the state, and the rest of the state lives off of us, right? That's the way the core works in the core periphery model. And the periphery is a lesser developed area. So we as the core in Northern Virginia, we have a lot of jobs, we have a lot of migration, there's a lot of wealth in this area, and that then is going to kind of support the periphery. If we look at it from a country level, we would look at the core being the megalopolis of the Boston down to New York, down to DC. That's that kind of area, that megalopolis area that we speak of. That is our core area. And then the outside, that flyover country, that's our periphery. If we bring it out to the world level, we have our well-developed core, our more developed countries, North America, specifically US and Canada, England, Germany, France, that well-developed core in the north and then the periphery of the south. Now, here's the thing. The core is going to take from the periphery, whether it's resources, whether it's migration patterns, and they're going to try and give back to the periphery a finished good, a manufactured good, or some type of service in the case of Fairfax County, Loudoun County, and the rest of the area. So when we talk about the core periphery model, it's a very controversial thing because the core always says, well, wait a second, this periphery model is kind of sucking away all our finances, whether it's taxes in the case of Virginia, whether it's economic aid in the sense of the more developed world versus the less developed world versus the less developed world. But at the same time, the less developed countries and the less developed areas of Virginia are saying, well, wait a second. You should be supporting us because you're making all the money and you're taking all of our stuff. So why shouldn't you be supporting us? So that's one of the things that we see going on there. So I hope that was able to answer your question on the core periphery model. Kyle says, hi, Mr. Swain. Hello, Kyle. All right. So next question from Kyle here is, can you go over the difference between GPS, GIS, and all of those other gizmos? Well, Kyle, we're going to go ahead and talk about that right now. So the GPS, GIS, and I believe the other gizmo that you speak of is remote sensing. GPS is global positioning system. That is how we figure out where we are. The global positioning system tries to figure out where are we, and what it works through is a series of triangulation. We, of course, are moving in our car or our bodies if we're playing Pokemon Go. There are satellites going around, and then the place we're going to is stationary. So this triangulation works out to GPS, and it's used for directional purposes. GIS, the Geographic Information System, is essentially a series of maps, one on top of another, on top of another, on top of another, on top of another, to give us a complete picture of our world. Now, let's look at a GIS map, for example. If we want to go very simplistic GIS map, let's talk about Google Maps. Now, how can Google Maps be? That's a GPS, the device, yes, but it's also a GIS system, very simple GIS system, because if you think about it, think about what you can do on Google Maps. You can turn on traffic or turn off traffic. You can turn on elevation or off elevation. You can turn on the satellite or on the road features. You can turn on and off a bunch of things. Those things you're turning on and off are a series of maps. And that's what we're looking at when we're looking at the GIS, a Geographic Information System. Now, we can get really detailed with GIS. We could have a map of just streets. We can have a map of just land use. We can have a map of just water. We can have a map of just foliage. We can have a map of just schools and points of interest. We can have a whole bunch of stuff. And what we turn on or off is going to tell us a different point of view, which is why we always talk about that maps are like men, that they are lying, that they are going to take some things in, leave some things out. And that is what we talk about when we talk about GPS. So when we talk about GPS, we're talking about the idea of where things are. GIS, we're talking about trying to using other maps to give us a complete picture or take away things to give us a more consolidated picture. And remote sensing is the remote acquisition of data by satellites going all across the earth. This is where we're looking for things. Usually we're using this for physical geography. We're looking for maybe methane distributions for greenhouse gases and global warming, or we're looking at water vapor or other types of stuff. But when we talk about remote sensing, we're looking at areas of the, we're usually looking at areas of the earth from that perspective. And that's all the gizmos that you speak of. Kareem asks, what did Lewis Worth say about cities? Kareem, check your spelling on that because I'm not really sure where you're going with that. Emily Norton asks, could you go over the concept of a barrio? Yes, we can go over the concept of a barrio. A barrio was what we talked about when we were talking about ethnicity, and the idea that there are areas of a city. When we talk about barrios, it's usually in a derogatory way. Barrios are traditionally Spanish-speaking areas of a city, or Latin American areas that are more kind of dilapidated and run down. The term ghetto sometimes gets used to describe barrios, but what a ghetto is, we must be sure we're looking at it from a historically accurate perspective. A ghetto is an area where an ethnic group is forced to live in. Barrios are not necessarily areas where people are forced to live in. They are instead areas where there are areas of a city where people happen to live. And it is, again, primarily we view it as a Spanish-speaking area of a city or a Spanish quote-unquote ghetto, even though that's not the appropriate term for it. But the idea of the barrio is this area of a city that is traditionally not nearly as well off, underclassed, malnourished, all that stuff that you would expect of, but it's again used in a negative connotation, as a negative racial or ethnic connotation towards it. So that's what a barrio is in that regards. All right, next question there we have totally skipped Noza. How could I forget? But before that, we have another one from Maheen over there. Could you talk about concentric zone? Maheen, I think I talked about concentric zone model. I think I talked about the sector model. If I didn't, ask another question with it. But I will talk about the central place theory, and then Noza, I will get to your question. And I sure hope that you have a prom date at this point in time, or perhaps someone in here you can ask to prom via the human geography review session. No would be my answer to you, but here we go. All right, central place theory for Maheen. The central place theory is this idea that there is a hierarchy of services that are provided in a city or in an area. So if we think about the central place theory, one of the ways I like to think about it is there are various cities and settlements of different sizes. We have the city, we have a hamlet, we have a town, we have all these different areas. Well, instead of getting confused with, well, what's each of those? Think about it this way, Maheen. Think about it that in Fairfax County, we have one major college, and that is George Mason University. That's our city for this example. And then we have a whole bunch of high schools that feed into that college for people that choose to go there. Feeding into those high schools are a lot more elementary schools, middle schools, excuse me. Then feeding into all of those middle schools are all of those elementary schools. Well, what the central place theory says is that the size of the settlement is going to dictate the goods and the services that are going to be provided within that particular settlement. So, for example, if we think about our elementary schools are not very big. They don't take up a lot of geographic area. So if you think about your elementary school where you live, your elementary school is probably right up the road from where you live. And what you'll probably see is you probably don't have to cross a main road. It's within a neighborhood, all that good stuff. That's your elementary school. Now your middle school, you might have to take a bus to cross a main road, but it's not all that far away. Your high school might be the furthest distance from you. Well, what you're going to see then is that if you take that back to the central place theory, certain goods and services can't be supported by such a small area. So much like our elementary school is not going to have a lot of teachers, not going to have a lot of students, because you might have 4 elementary schools within your just little small town in which you live. Well, if we think about elementary schools, let's call an elementary school a 7-Eleven, right? We don't need that many people to support a 7-Eleven, and 7-Elevens are all over the place. So I'm going to ask you a hypothetical question, Maheen. How far are you willing to drive for a delicious ice-cold Slurpee? Probably not very far. And you're not willing to drive very far because they're pretty convenient to get them everywhere, and that's the point. Much like elementary schools are convenient, Slurpees are convenient, deliciously convenient as well. And so people aren't going to drive a long distance, but the good news is that there's not that many people needed to support a Slurpee machine. So when we talk about the amount of people to support area or service, that's called threshold. The distance people are willing to travel, that's called range. So we have threshold and we have range. Now, let's go up one level. If we look at, say, a town, right? We moved up from a hamlet to a town. That might be our middle school. Well, that might be, for example, a Starbucks. Starbucks are probably a little bit more further away than, say, a 7-Eleven would be. Or maybe it's McDonald's or whatever it might be. The idea here is that as you go up, there's going to be greater number of people needing to support something, much like there's going to be more teachers at a middle school than an elementary school. There's going to be more students at a middle school than an elementary school. Same exact thing. As we go up, there's going to be greater thresholds and greater ranges. So when we go to George Mason University, people from all over the country come to George Mason University. That's a huge range. And there's a ton of people who go there, more than your high school, more than your elementary school, more than your middle school. And that's a good way of looking at the central place theory. And all of that is in this hexagonal type of shape, where when we look at our country, or we look at our area, we're looking at the idea that there's these various levels, these various sizes of cities, and each one of those settlements is going to have a certain amount of goods and services. There's McDonald's all over the place. They're pretty cheap, and people aren't going to drive very far. There's not many hospitals. There's not many universities because they require a lot of people, and people will drive much further to go to a good university than get a good Slurpee, except Mr. Swain. Mr. Swain will drive to the ends of the earth for a great Slurpee and has done so. Little known fact, Mr. Swain has driven as far as 15 minutes away for a Slurpee just to get the right one. Consistency of your Slurpee is very important. And that's the central place theory. So hopefully that explained the central place theory for you, Maheen. Noza, now on to your question. Noza, your question is, what are some consequences of various densities and distributions? Well, Noza, various densities and distributions are very important, because if we have a density that is going to be very, we're talking about the word concentration here. If we have a concentration, if we're going to have an area that's very clustered, that could lead to possibly overcrowding. If we have an area that's very sparsely populated, that might mean that we have room for people to move in. So in areas that are highly concentrated, adding more and more density might make people more upset, might lead to overcrowding, infrastructure problems. Areas that are sparsely populated can take a little bit more of that migration. They might not want it, but they can take it. And when we talk about density and distributions, make sure you know which densities are which. Agricultural densities, the amount of farmers for farmland. Arithmetic density, just the amount of people per the amount of area. And then physiological density, amount of people per farmland. And those are that. But when we look at consequences of density can cause people to think there's overcrowding when there's not. They can think there's problems when they're not, be a little bit less willing that people move to their area. But concentration, important with our dispersed and our clustered. So take a look at that. All right, we got that. Back to Anina's question, and Anina's question here is, what are consolidated MSAs? Consolidated MSAs, Anina, are things called consolidated metropolitan statistical areas. Now, what that is when you have two metropolitan statistical areas that run into each other. So here's Baltimore, here's DC. What happens is they basically run into each other, and that's a consolidated metropolitan statistical area. So instead of having Baltimore and Washington over here, what happens is there's a tough way to say, where does DC stop and where does Baltimore begin? That's a tough thing to say. That's why it's called a consolidated metropolitan statistical area. So if you are in kind of like, if you're kind of where my knuckle is over here, you could just as easily go to DC, or you could just as easily go to Baltimore. That's a consolidated metropolitan statistical area. When two cities are close to one another and the commuter zone, the impact is tough to tell where one starts and where one stops. That's consolidated metropolitan statistical area. Good example of why we're a consolidated metropolitan statistical area is Baltimore Washington Airport, or BWI, is a good example of a consolidated metropolitan statistical area. All right, Kyle says, why are squatter settlements on the outskirts of LDCs not in the center? Kyle, that's a great question, and I'm going to answer that question for you. A squatter settlement is an area that's on the outskirts of a less developed country because the people that need the jobs in the inner city can't afford the price of inner city housing. Well, why don't they just commute? Because they can't commute. So what they'll do is they'll set up squatter settlements on the outskirts of the city so they can still access the city, but they can't live in the city because they can't afford it. So the squatter settlements try and solve that problem of how do we go into the city, how do we use the city and its resources, jobs, even though we can't afford to live in the city. and we do squatter settlements, and that's the idea. So squatter settlements in less developed countries would be highly desirable areas in more developed countries. For example, a squatter settlement in DC might be Roslyn, for example. That would be a squatter settlement if we were a less developed country. Just outside the city, all you gotta do is go over a bridge to get there. Man, that'd be a big squatter settlement. For us, it's buku bucks in terms of housing. So squatter settlements are outside the city because they need the jobs of the central city, can't afford it, so they make squatter settlements, which are, of course, non-permanent housing in that area. Kyle says, I'm free. I think that's in regard to my comment about NOSA. Rachel K asks question, can you explain some positive and negative effects of the Green Revolution? Yes, I can, Rachel. The Green Revolution, of course, the biggest positive effect of the Green Revolution is the idea that we are able to feed more of the world's population through things like genetically modified foods, through things like double cropping. We are able to feed a population that we might not be able to feed. And this goes back to our idea, which was asked before, about Malthus and Thomas Malthus's theory. This is really important because without things like Mr. Borglum, we could not have fed India with the double cropping of corn. So positives, definitely the fact that we can feed a population, definitely the fact that we are not going to have starvation going on. And profit-wise, it helps farmers as well because they can provide for people and they can continue to grow things. So it's going to help farmers' prices. On a negative problem, what this has done is it has led to some problems in depletion of resources much faster than would have done before, need for fertilizers that leads to the salinization of the soil or not being allowed to grow as much there because you're kind of using it more quickly than you would have. So this Green Revolution also kind of an unintended consequence as well, is it's kind of continued to allow the population to grow. Which is, it's kind of a double-edged sword, right? We don't want people to die, but at the same point in time, we kind of want to curb population growth a little bit. So the negative part about the Green Revolution is from an environmental perspective, that it's really kind of straining the resources of the environment. And from a health consequence, we're still not totally genetically modified foods. Jury's still out. And we talk about this in class, is that when we look at our square watermelons, yeah, it's just a square watermelon. It's good for, packing things a little bit better. But are there any long-term effects on that? We don't think so right now. Every study we've seen says no. But if we continue to do this, will that possibly lead to health concerns later on? Who knows? That's why some countries don't want our help when it comes to the Green Revolution, because they don't want to deal with the potential consequences of it. Good question there by Rachel. Next question here is for Emily Norton. She says, are those squatter settlements seen in the sector model? Good question, Emily. Squatter settlements are seen in the sector model as well, because again, they're outside of the central city. They might use the sector model to get into those transportation routes. So yes, you will see squatter settlements along the sector model as well, because it's just outside of the city. All right, Nosa says, I'll think about it. I think that's still with Kyle. And Anina asks question, how do the city models change from region to region like in Europe? A great question there, Anina. City models change from region to region like in Europe, just over the idea of essentially of time as well as what's going on in a particular area. There are some cities that might have been set up solely for a religious idea. And if you have cities that are set up for a religious idea, then of course you're going to have these kind of central cities that are going to be in the concentric zone. If you have other cities that are set up from purely a resource perspective, we want to make it a manufacturing hub and get goods in and out like some areas of England, then you're going to see areas that are much more of the sector model. So the biggest reason of why things vary from region to region in Europe is, why are they set up? Look back at why are they set up, and that'll tell you why. Or better yet, look at a model structure and I can tell you why it was set up. Now, one of the things that we are seeing on a whole is that the multiple nuclei model is really, really starting to overtake a lot of those areas. And that's because we have a tourist section, we have an old section of the town, we have a business section of the town. And what we see happening is there are certain cities, a lot of cities, that are starting to fall into this multiple nuclei. That there's a tourist section, there's a business section, there's an old town section, there is a new trendy section. That multiple nuclei model is starting to go all over the world through the ideas of gentrification and all sorts of stuff like that. So that's the idea of that. All right, gotta buy that paper. What is even going on here? Jess asks, what are the difference between density, distribution, concentration, and pattern? Oh my gosh, Jess, you missed it. We talked about it today in class, but you know what? We're gonna do it again just for you, Jess. Density, distribution, concentration, and pattern. Let's start with pattern. That's the easiest. Pattern is simply how they are arranged, how things are arranged when they are out there. Are they arranged in a circular fashion? Are they arranged in a linear fashion? How are they arranged? That is what we're talking about with the idea of a pattern. When we talk about the idea of a concentration, concentration is how we measure the distribution. It's a way of measuring distribution. Are things concentrated? If they are, that means they're very close together. Or are they dispersed, which means they're very far out? When we talk about concentration, we're measuring the distribution. Is it spread out or is it close? Remember, we can have the same exact density, meaning we can have the same amount of kids, one kid in one area, another kid in another area, the same seats. We do it all the time in class. When I move you guys together, I'm not changing the density. There's still one person per desk here, one person per desk there, so on and so forth. But what I am doing is I am changing the concentration, how spread out you are. Are you spread out? Are you not spread out? And then finally, density, of course, is the frequency with which something occurs. And then distribution is the arrangement of a feature in space. And again, that goes back to our concentration. How are they arranged in space? Are they arranged very closely? Yes. Are they arranged far apart? Whatever. And that's the idea of that. All right, next question here belongs to Kyle, who says, thanks for sharing, you always brighten my day. Well, Kyle, you know what? I'm glad I can turn that frown upside down. Kareem asks a question, what's the difference between diction, dialect, and accent? A very good question there. Diction, dialect, and accent. Kareem, really, for our purposes, there is no difference between the two. I can't imagine they would ever ask you that question on the test or ever ask you to deal with something along those lines. But a dialect is more of a regional thing. A dialect is word choices as well as pronunciation. It's a greater level of verity, as opposed to an accent is just how you say words. So for example, I might have a New York accent, but I don't have as much of a New York dialect. What I mean by that is I might have an accent on things like ask and drawer and all these other types of things, but what I don't have is I don't have a dialect in the sense that I am constantly talking like a New Yorker. And I'm saying things like, how you guys doing all the time? And we're talking about sneakers and coffee talk and all that type of stuff. We're not talking about that. That's more of a dialect. So an accent is how we say the words. The dialect is not only how we say the words, it's also the word choices that we use as well. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about that. All right, let's continue to get those questions in. It's 9:03, so we are in overtime here. And I'm going to keep on answering questions for you guys. If you have any questions, some good questions that people have been asking. Certain things I think that haven't come up yet. I think we've covered a lot of stuff. One of the things we haven't come up yet is the idea of the Rostow model of development. One of the things I want to talk about the Rostow model of development real quick is remember the idea of the Brostow model. For those of you that are in my class, for those of you that are joining us from across the county, a belated welcome to you. Hope you guys are enjoying tonight's online review session. The Rostow model, I like to call with my students the LeBrostow model in the idea of LeBron James. And why I say that is if we think about the Rostow model's idea is how can we find something that we do better than everybody else and use that to capitalize to become more developed. And the reason why I call it the LeBrostow model is if we think about LeBron James has an innate skill of basketball and then has used and developed that skill to become a fantastic basketball player, but also has used that talent to then transform other parts of his life, of his community. And that's exactly what the Rostow model wants you to do. It's not just about if you're in the Middle East using oil all the time. No, it's about exporting oil. With the money you make from exporting oil, that's when you develop other portions of your economy. And you're making things besides just oil dregs. You're making computers. You're making televisions, you're making cell phones, you're making these things for consumers. So you're finding out what you do better than anybody else, and then you're using that to make money, and then you're using that to then spread out the other portion of it and become a more developed society. So that's the Rostow model. Contrast that with the self-sufficiency approach, in which that's the high school approach, right? That you try to be good at everything, and sometimes when you try and be good at everything, we know that, we struggle to be good at anything. Selena B asks a question, can you go over supranational organizations? Supranational organizations are, of course, the idea that they are multiple countries that are working together towards a common goal, towards a specific good. So if we look at the idea of like the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, when we talk about that, we are trying to use the OPEC people are trying to control the price of oil. So that way they benefit from that. Those are other countries that are working together to try and raise oil to make themselves more wealthy, right? That's the goal. That's the idea of a supranational organization. Supranational organizations are funded and are founded, rather, to try and have a common good. United Nations, their common good, avoid another world war. NATO, their common good, have a military alliance. The European Union, their common good, promote economic wealth in Europe. So that's the idea of a supranational organization. Now, remember, supranational organizations are important because this is usually only done for a very specific reason. Sovereignty is something that countries don't like to give up. They like to hold on to their power. And so they're giving it up for usually only a very specific reason. And that specific reason is either to make money, to preserve peace, to have military protection, so on and so forth. So that's the idea of that. All right. Can you go over the different types of agriculture? Conservative, intensive, subsistence, etc. Correct. Yes. The idea of agriculture here is there are two ways. There are two major types of agriculture. When we talk about agriculture, we're talking about commercial and we're talking about subsistence. Subsistence farmers are farmers that are farming for survival. They are trying to farm for their very survival. And so when we talk about subsistence farmers, we are talking about people that are going to be farming usually very small areas. So when we talk about intensive subsistence farming, that's when you're working very, very hard on a usually small area of land. Wet rice, for example, comes to mind. Now, there's another type of subsistence farming that can take place, and that is extensive farming, meaning you are farming a large area of land. This occurs in the dry lands of the world, areas like Mongolia, for example. You also have shifting cultivation and slash and burn agriculture, which is also an example of extensive subsistence agriculture, where you're farming for survival, but you're farming on a large area of land. Commercial agriculture, of course, you are farming to make a profit. And we talked about the von Thunen model earlier on. So please scroll back to probably close to the beginning portion of the review, and we talked about the thing over there a lot in that regards. All right, so those are our questions. All right, I'm going to give you guys a couple more minutes here to ask any last-minute questions that you may have on the human geography exam, any questions you may have on that. So one of the things that I want to focus in on you guys here as we begin to wrap up is if I could give you any parting knowledge and advice before you prepare here for your exam, put the final touches on your exam, is to think about what we talked about for the entire year, and that is the why of where. Why are things where they are? Why is this occurring? Where is this occurring? So we talked about one of the things I want to focus on is I'm sorry, I don't know if it's Mr. Wolf or Miss Wolf, but going back to your question about the agriculture, remember one of the things we want to focus on is why is agriculture where it is? And that kind of goes back to your question of intensive subsistence agriculture, right? Intensive subsistence agriculture has to occur in an area that is enough for people to survive, that's not too hot, that's not too cold, that's in this temperate area. So they're farming kind of year round. They're farming for their survival, right? And when I talked about the idea of extensive, why is extensive found where it is? Well, extensive agriculture is usually going to be found in areas that the land is not as valuable to grow stuff on. So if we think about the dry lands of Mongolia, there's pastoral nomadism in the dry lands of Mongolia. Why? Well, because there's naturally going to be animals over in that area, but there's not a lot of ability to grow things. So instead of growing things, what these pastoral nomads do is they kind of have this seasonal migration of the animals. They follow the seasonal migration of the animals. The animals are then brought to a market, slaughtered, and all that type of stuff. But the idea, of course, there is that's why they do it. Why is slash and burn agriculture done where it is? Well, because it's in a tropic area where it's completely undergrown, it's completely overgrown. And so what they're going to do is slash that area. They're going to burn it, bring the nutrients back, and then farm that area. And then eventually the jungle is going to reclaim that area, and they're going to need to go back and do it all over again. Why is commercial agriculture found where it's found? Well, because when we talk about commercial agriculture, we got to be close to the city. Anybody close to the city wants fresh produce, wants fresh milk, wants that type of stuff. Well, when you have that stuff, got to be close to the city. So our dairy is close to the city. Why is our dairy close to the city? Not just because of the milk chip, but also because that's pretty valuable land. But you also make a lot of money on dairy as well and fresh produce. So that's located close to the city. Forests are close to the city, not because they're really all that valuable, because they're heavy to transport. So you don't want to transport a far distance. Extensive field crops, further you get from the city, in that third ring, that's going to be not as valuable land. So what are you going to do? You're going to farm the heck out of that land because you can grow so much because the land is cheaper. And you don't have to worry about perishability because you're just growing corn and wheat. Corn and wheat don't really perish. So you can transport that further. And then, of course, you have ranching, which is even further out. They can, one, self-transport themselves. That takes care of the transportation costs. Two, that's usually not going to be a desirable land. Now, here's the problem with all this type of stuff. This is a model. And models, as we talk about in class all the time, are not perfect. So if we think about areas that might be too barren, that might be close to the city, well, that's going to impact the von Thunen model. So again, if I could leave you with a parting shot, it is this, and that is focus on the why of where. Why are cities where they are? Why are they organized the way they are? Why are cultures where they are? Why is religions where they are, as Miss Norton asked? Why are there languages where there are? That's what we're talking about here. We're trying to, and that's the whole year. But we can sum up the whole year in a nutshell. Philosophically, why are things where they are? If you can tell me why things are where they are, that's going to be a good study tool for you. So when you're thinking about it, continue to ask yourself that question over and over again. Faria Ahmed asks, do we have to know any types of resources like renewable resources, non-renewable resources? Faria, they will ask you about some of those things. I don't really talk about that stuff all that much because it's one of those things where I don't think that it is for us all that. It's a lot of common sense, right? Renewable resources are things like water, wind, solar, and we've kind of transitioned towards that. Non-renewable resources, fossil fuels, all that type of stuff. That's what we're trying to transition away from. One's pollution, one's not. There's really not much more to that than that. And one of the things that we're talking about is the idea of the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution focused a lot on fossil fuels. We're trying to get away from fossil fuels and non-renewable energy and go into renewable energy. That's really kind of what we need to know in a nutshell. There is a lot more stuff in there. But again, a lot of it's, I think, common sense in that regard. So I didn't want to belabor the point in that regard. All right. I think that is about it. It's about 9:15, 1 hour and 15 minutes of work here for you. It's my hope that you guys could find this to be beneficial to you. Again, this is on demand anytime, so you can look at this whenever you want. If you want to look at last year's, if you just click on my name, you could see last year's and the year before that. If you just can't get enough Mr. Swain, you can go ahead and check that out. Want to thank those of you that were from other schools that came by to listen to this. And again, want to thank my class for that as well. Again, hope you guys found this to be beneficial. Have a fantastic rest of your night. Good luck on the exam. You guys are going to do well. A reminder, you know more than you think you know. So just keep that in the back of your mind. You know more than you think you do. Okay? Remember, when all else fails, you're competing against ninth graders. Have a great night, and we will catch you down the road.